Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have Daniel Schulof. He's the CEO of KetoNatural Pet Foods. And we're going to talk about KetoNatural and his background, etc. So, Daniel, thank you for coming.
Of course. Thank you for having me, Richard. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background. What got you interested in dog food and why keto? But tell me your background first, please.
Yeah, sure. I used to be an attorney, an intellectual property litigation attorney. I worked at a big international firm helping large businesses litigate intellectual property disputes. And I had been doing that for about 5 years when I got my first dog. My dog was a big male Rottweiler, a quintessential Rottweiler, like big, strong, and like with a protective instinct. And so he was somebody that needed a daily exercise in order to become a polite member of society. And so basically I'd always been kind of a science-minded person. And I don't know if you've had other lawyers on your show, if you know any in your life, but one thing you sometimes hear them talk about. I know a lot, yeah. One thing that when I hear this comment, it resonates with me, that when you're a litigator, you develop a certain kind of like intellectual hubris where like you have to learn at an expert level the subject matter involved in any kind of like dispute you may be in. So like in the course of my career, we litigated like trade secrets involving aircraft. Like, I don't know anything about engineering aircraft. Like voice over IP technology, and like I don't know anything about voice over IP technology. And so like you do that enough times, you develop a certain kind of like confidence that you can figure out, you can teach yourself expert level knowledge, right? And so when I had this dog and I was like trying to exercise him effectively and like make sure that he wouldn't bite anybody, I got serious about understanding like the evidentiary record around what exercise is good for dogs and what it's like for them and how you do it effectively and all that kind of stuff. And it led me basically to understand how big of a problem obesity is among dogs in the dogs and cats in the Western world. And it's a colossal problem. It's worse than a lifetime of smoking for them. It's like literally the impact it's been shown to be on their lifespan is more significant than a human being smoking cigarettes for their entire life.
I noticed that, the problem is though, dogs are masters of looking sad, like they've never eaten. Like whenever I come home, we have 4 of them, and no matter what they've had, I look at them and my wife goes, "Don't be fooled. They just had this, that, and the other." And I look at them, I say, "Is this true?" They just look at me with glistening eyes and wagging tails. Can't tell.
Familiar with that look. Mine do the same thing. And like, if you ask, at least at the time when I was learning all this, which was like 2012, The mainstream veterinary explanation for like why half the dogs in America are overweight or obese was basically that like either it's the case that you're just describing where it's like pet owners are too weak-willed and like we can't stop ourselves from making them fat when they beg, or we're too lazy and we can't give them the exercise they need, or we're just too stupid and we just don't understand that obesity is such a big deal for them. And none of that really added up for me. And so I basically went down the rabbit hole trying to understand more about that issue, and basically ended up quitting my job and working on a book that took me 4 years to write that I published in 2016. And it's an examination of the obesity problem among pets in the Western world, and why in my eyes, the veterinary dogma on this issue doesn't really add up.
Well, there's the concept of people food versus dog food, which I think is very damaging, because you label something as dog food and then you think, oh, that's what the dog's supposed to have and nothing else. You think you're being a good pet owner maybe by only giving it kibble, or exercise is not even mentioned in that circumstance. But what do you consider to be some of the veterinary dogma that causes problems?
Yeah, if you pick up a veterinary nutrition textbook that's used to teach vets about nutritional subjects, what's implicitly endorsed in that book is that to a large degree, all calories are created equal and carbohydrate is perfectly healthy for dogs and cats. And I disagree with both of those contentions in a significant way.
I consider them kind of crazy, but I've heard some people trying to put dogs on a vegan diet. But then I've also spoken to some vets that say, dogs can be almost all carnivore. So that seems to be a better diet for them. But I have yet to find someone that says, oh, just give them kibble.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when trying to get to the bottom of a subject that's been studied through the use of the scientific method, you can make the most progress working with the biggest, most powerful fundamental concepts first. And in just about all issues of biology, that most powerful fundamental scientific concept is the theory of evolution via natural selection. And in the case of dogs, and it's why I begin, like the first chapter of my book is basically my experience living with the biologists at the Yellowstone Wolf Project, which is like the premier place for the study of wild gray wolves in the United States. And the reason that we start there in the book is because dogs and wolves are incredibly genetically similar. They're two distinct species, but they can literally breed with each other, which is like more often how you'll hear a biologist describe the distinction between one species and another. They typically can't breed. Dogs and wolves are so similar they can breed together. And there are literally like more than 1 million dog-wolf hybrids in the United States right now. And there's and why that's interesting is because if you look at populations of wild wolves, what you'll see is none of the chronic diseases that you see in dogs and cats raised in captivity in the Western world. Things like these common, very common, epidemic level, non-communicable diseases. It's like when you see the things that we call diseases of modernity that are like very, very common in both human and pet populations, but that aren't communicable. They're not COVID. They don't spread from dog to dog. There's something sociologically, culturally, environmentally that's wrong, that's giving rise to it in mass. And so because wolves are so similar and they don't get any of these diseases, you can do there's a natural experiment going on right now. In what ways is my dog living like a wolf currently lives? Because that's the way it essentially has evolved to live. And among other, no, go ahead.
Well, I'm listening. Go ahead. I'm just saying, okay.
Yeah. So in the case of wolves, if you want to understand what it's like to live like a wolf, you go to the folks at the Yellowstone Wolf Project. They know better than anybody else in the world. And what they will tell you, among other things, is first of all, when it comes to diet, wolves consume 0.0% dietary carbohydrate. Okay. So and dogs and wolves shared the same genetic lineage for more than 99.9% of their evolution as a canine species. Okay. Like I said, they're so similar, they interbreed. And so even today, wolves eat 0.0% carbohydrate. And if you look essentially at when carbohydrate got introduced into the diet of the domestic dog as it evolved, you're talking about something that entered its lineage after, like I said, after 99.9% of its evolution had occurred already. And so you're dealing with something that's incredibly novel, really new, hasn't had time yet to impact the genome through natural selection, something like that. And so when you have somebody who says, you should feed your dog an all carnivore diet, well, one thing you can rest assured about that is by far the most common thing in its evolutionary heritage. That is what, like I said, wolves eat literally 0.0% carbohydrate. They eat meat and literally nothing else. So if you do put your dog on a vegan diet, what you're essentially doing is you're rolling the dice. You're saying, I trust the food scientists practicing today, the folks that make this product, well enough to know exactly what my dog needs, that I'm going to essentially allow them to overrule Mother Nature. So this thing has never been done in my dog's history. If we engineer the product just right, it supposedly will be healthy enough for the animal. And I'm not willing to do that with my dogs. That's too risky to me.
That's good. Good.
That's my perspective on those kind of matters.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
What do pet owners tend to feed their dogs? Do they feed them just kibble? Have you seen like the quote unquote dog food versus human food?
There's
framing affects people. Like, what do you observe?
Sure. Something like 90% of the U.S. pet food market is kibble products. And making kibble, I've come to learn since publishing my book and founding a dog food company, is basically like making meaty little nubs of pasta or bread. You essentially like mix a bunch of dry ingredients together with wet ingredients, heat them up, they bind together into like a little dough, and then you cut it into little pieces, little nuggets of kibble, and then dry it so that it's shelf stable. And the thing that's implicit in that is the fact that you need dietary carbohydrate, you need starch. Like, if you ever tried to, I don't know why you do this, but I ask people that frame it this way all the time. If you ever try to bake a loaf of bread without using flour, or make a cupcake without using flour, you'll know that the dough doesn't want to hold together when you heat it up. That's like what the flour does. It's the starch, it gelatinizes when you make it hot. And what that does is binds all the other ingredients together. So you get a dough. And if you take the flour out, that doesn't happen. It just crumbles. And so kibble's kind of made the same way. It doesn't want to hold together if you don't use dietary carbohydrate. As a result, in addition, dietary carbohydrate is hugely inexpensive as an ingredient. Like a calorie of flour is something like 10% the cost of a calorie of chicken or chicken byproduct. So there's a strong business incentive on a couple of different grounds to sell these kinds of products to people. And so that's the backbone of the industry, basically. Like I said, 90% of pet food products are that style. The alternatives that make up the small little, the remainder, are either raw products. So these are sold either frozen or freeze dried. And because they're not subjected to the manufacturing process that makes kibble, which is called extrusion. They're not subjected to that. You don't need starch. And so you can make raw pet food products that are all meat or largely meat with much less.
Oh yeah. At the farmer's market, they have like these big, we call them meat pucks, like a hockey puck, and it's frozen, and
yeah,
the dogs like it just out of the freezer. They like it frozen, actually, and they eat it and they're happy. They have like frozen meatballs and they love it,
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Yeah, that's a great, for me, we sell KetoNatural makes very low carbohydrate kibble. We're the only company that's currently doing things, or, the first company to ever really crack this nut of making kibble with very little carbohydrate. That said, for me, the gold standard for feeding your dog, if things like cost and convenience are not issues, I think the gold standard is a commercially prepared, so not a homemade, all meat. So not something that's, meat mixed with lots of potato and other vegetables, raw diet. That's the closest thing that to me is the kind of the gold standard for, and the three qualities. You want it commercially prepared as opposed to home prepared, because if you buy a commercially prepared product, there are all sorts of like micronutrient, vitamins and minerals that science has shown over a long period of time dogs require in certain quantities and in certain ratios in order to prevent them from developing like deficiency diseases. And if you buy a commercial product, you can feel reasonably confident that it complies with all that. There's a regulatory regime in the US that's pretty well evidentiary backed and essentially requires that all the products hit all those metrics. Whereas if you make something for your dog at home, you're not going to necessarily, be able to do that. You run a little risk. And then the all meat and raw thing is just because that's the most, like I said, evolutionarily consistent, number one. And number two, it avoids like all the dangers of carbohydrate that I highlighted before. So something like you described.
So what did you find out? So ideally, zero carbs is the goal, but why put carbs in there at all? Is it just needed to stabilize the product, or like what, why did you settle in on carbs of just a low amount?
Oh yeah. It's because of the manufacturing challenge I highlighted. It's like basically you can't make kibble. We tried, our primary goal was to make a kibble with as little carbohydrate as humanly possible. And so we were able to get it down to less than 5% of the product. So it's quite low, but we can't get it to zero without the whole thing just falling apart. We'd be selling like, dust.
And what other nuances or what else did you find out that is important to include in the kibble to give it the max nutrition? Like, are you putting in any probiotics or, what other facets of the nutrition are important?
For my money, where you should be focused is on nutrients as opposed to ingredients. There's a whole lot about the pet food industry that is gross. The kind of manufacturing and regulatory side of it, it's an ugly industry. There's a lot of consumer deception. There's a lot of bad faith. There's a lot of making products with very wholesome looking imagery that are incredible, do very bad things to these animals' bodies. And also, as a result of that, largely, consumer practices are kind of wonky. Like the things that are trends on the consumer side in the pet food industry often are things that are completely disconnected from the issues that really matter to pet owners, which things like health. And so one of those is there's a big tendency for consumers to really hone in on ingredient quality. You can't see me, but I'm making the air quotes symbols with my hands because it's a kind of a nonsense concept. It's a concept that has no real definition and is sort of just about how much or little the consumer feels a sense of disgust when thinking about the ingredient. So for me, the much better way to think about what to feed your dog is to think about nutrients rather than ingredients, because there's a whole load of science that tells you what is and isn't healthy in that domain. And so for me, one of the most important nutritional issues is to reduce carbohydrate as much as possible, full stop. The second one is to make sure that your dog is getting at least as much protein as it needs. I exist on the weird fringes of the keto and low carb community. Like there are a lot of folks out there who identify as I'm a keto person, I'm a low carb person, not just research scientists either, just like everyday people. And a lot of them believe that the most efficacious kind of keto diet for them is one that's very high in fat content, that there are reasons why you don't want to feed protein, essentially, if your goal is to deepen ketosis as much as possible. I'm not one of those people when it comes to how to feed your dog. The average wolf consumes about 63% of its calories from protein sources. And we know through scientific research of all different kinds that protein is invaluable for dogs. It does all sorts of things, beyond just the basics of like helping it build and maintain skeletal muscle. Unfortunately, the regulations in the US only require that pet food, dog food products contain, I think it's 22% protein in order to be considered like get the regulatory pass, basically. I think that you want to be much higher than that to ensure that your dog gets what it needs. And so for me, it's not as easy as saying maximize protein intake, because fats are an essential nutrient for dogs. You absolutely have to feed them some degree of them, but trying to mimic that kind of wolf ratio of getting as close to something like 65% of calories from protein, including all the essential amino acids, just like human beings. Dogs have some amino acids they can make on their own. Others they have to get through food. Maximizing the intake of the essential ones is a vital thing as well. So yeah, those are a few of them.
Well, so you get protein content. What about fat content and micronutrients and other components of the kibble? Are you putting in everything with the kitchen sink, or are you sticking with the basics?
So with regard to fat, there's there's two things to think about. One is the baseline that the regulators say you got to give your dog this much fat, or else you're essentially going to give it a deficiency disease. It's like, like I said, an essential nutrient. And I think that amount works out to something like 11% of the product. Don't quote me on that, but it's something like that. Then there's the wolf baseline, right? Like if you subscribe to the notion that Mother Nature knows best and that trying to outsmart her by engineering something that you think is an improvement is kind of a folly, then you want to feed something that's closer to 30% fat, like reasonably high in fat calorie content. And so we split the difference somewhere in between. There's plenty more than the animal needs in order to avoid a deficiency disease, but it's not like a very fat forward product either. With respect to micronutrients, those aren't, it's not the case that there's any, in my eyes, any persuasive evidence that loading up on maximizing one specific micronutrient is, healthful for a dog. That it's some kind of medicine that essentially you want to take as much of it as possible. It's much more about making sure that you pass over the baselines that are required to avoid deficiency diseases. And then there are a few places where the ratios need to be right. So like with the nutrients calcium and phosphorus, in order to basically prevent the dog from developing growth abnormalities, you need to make sure those are consumed in a specific ratio. And so what you got to do is you got to do a lot of testing, basically. There's there are chemical analysis labs that basically for a fee would take your product and subject it to all kinds of testing. Will tell you exactly how much is in there. And it took us about a year of R&D work before we were able to sell a product that we felt good about that hit all the marks that we wanted it to hit. So yeah, we sell what's called a complete and balanced pet food product, which is basically has the regulator's seal of approval on it that it's all your dog needs to take in order to get all of the vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients that it needs.
Well, did you run into a problem where the requirements for a balanced diet or a balanced food, whatever it's called, were kind of against the principles that you've discovered through your research?
Well, it's interesting. Not directly, no, because if you read the regulations, so basically what the regulations look to, where they come from is from what's essentially the Bible of veterinary nutritional science research. It's a thing that the National Academies of Sciences puts out and updates every decade or so. That's called the nutrient requirements of dogs and cats. And it's basically just textbook, and it just walks through each class of nutrients and all of the existing research surrounding it. And it's totally fair, totally on point, totally good. And so all that stuff that's the nutritional profiles that the regulators require is all sensible enough as far as it goes. But it's what brands do with that that's really the shady business. Because what the national academies tell us and what's embodied in the regulations is that dietary carbohydrate, unlike fats, unlike protein, unlike all kinds of vitamins, all kinds of minerals, is not an essential nutrient for dogs and cats. If you take carbohydrate completely out of the diet, unlike protein, unlike fat, unlike vitamins and minerals, nothing weird or bad happens to the animal. There's no requirement for carbohydrate. It's not in the regulations. It's not in the science. And yet it is by far the most common nutrient found in pet foods. And so it's not like the profiles themselves are wrong. It's that they're being, I guess you call it misused, right? It's why are we using something that the dog does not require, and then taking away from the dog does nothing bad, and we're building the product around that? That's the ugly part of it.
So do you have a lot of customers that have been using your version of the kibble for a while? And if so, what do they notice in regards to their dogs?
Yeah, so there are a variety of things. I mean, we've been in business since 2017. So, we've got folks who have been on our product for 4 years. My dogs are the ones that have been eating it the longest of anyone in the world. And
your dogs are actually guinea pigs in one sense.
In a way, but I got to tell you, a lot went into, I wrote a book about I don't have kids. I'm 40. I don't have kids, and I never have. And my dogs are pretty important to me. I literally left my career to focus on them. And so I wasn't in the market to put them in any kind of jeopardy. That felt, that said.
No, I wasn't saying you're going to hurt them or anything, but
yeah,
it's kind of funny that in a way they are, they're still dogs, but they're guinea pigs as well. It's just a bad joke.
Yeah, no, it's just how it it's the only, maybe this is because I came to business kind of late in my life, being an entrepreneur, but it's the most obvious thing in the world to me that if you're going to go out there and sell a product to the public and you're going to tell them that they should use it, you damn well better use it yourself. You better put your name on it and make sure that you're using it yourself. Otherwise there's something implicit about the quality of the product in that. That said, so some of the things that are common are, number one, dogs lose body fat dramatically and reasonably quickly. You cannot make a dog obese without feeding it carbohydrate. So if you take a dog that's moderately overweight and put it on a very low carbohydrate diet, even if you keep the number of calories that it's eating the same, I repeat that, even if you don't change the calories at all, if you take the carbohydrate out of the diet, the dog will become lean. That's just a fact. It happens every one of our customers that happens to. So there are insanely, diabetes is a big problem among dogs and cats in the Western world. And even crazier is the fact that the standard of care for a dog that has diabetes is a prescription only product made by a big kibble company that's 40% dietary carbohydrate. And it's insane. It's insane. And so we have a lot of customers that have diabetic dogs that go, I couldn't believe that the product the vet recommended was 40% carbohydrate. We switched to yours, and now his blood sugar is far lower than it was before. We need far less insulin than we needed before, that kind of stuff.
Do dogs react very quickly, even if they're diabetic? First of all, what characterizes a diabetic dog? What happens to them versus humans? And when you give them the right food, how fast do they recover?
So it doesn't fit. The way that dogs get diabetes is not the same as the type 2, type 1 typology that you see in human beings. It's basically, it's closer to type 1 than type 2 in that it's an absolute insulin deficiency as opposed to a relative one. For those of your listeners that don't understand, pathophysiology of diabetes, basically diabetes is if you eat dietary carbohydrate, it goes into your bloodstream as glucose, sugar. And sugar's toxic if it hangs out in the blood for too long. And so your body deals with that by producing a hormone called insulin. And the insulin drives the glucose into other tissues where it can be held stably and prevent you from going into what's called a diabetic coma. If you have diabetes, you don't produce enough insulin to deal with the glucose. Type 2 diabetes is when your peripheral cells have basically become desensitized to insulin. You've had so much carbohydrate and so much insulin in your blood for so long that you need more and more and more and more of it, and you can no longer produce enough to actually manage it. It's a chronic developmental type disease. Whereas in type 1 diabetes, the pancreas you're born without them producing insulin very well. That's what I mean when I say an absolute deficiency. And with dogs, it's more like that. So while you can essentially cure a type 2 diabetic's diabetes by taking all dietary carbohydrate out of their diet, you don't cure a dog of diabetes by taking the carbohydrate out of its diet, but you make it much, much more manageable. The fix for diabetes, such as it is to inject insulin exogenously. You buy insulin, put it in a syringe, you inject it into the body to supplement what your body's able to make on its own. And it's expensive. It's a news item, probably seen in the news. And basically you put a dog on a very low carbohydrate diet that has diabetes, and it will very quickly, right after the first meal, you'll see lower blood sugar numbers, which mean you need less exogenous insulin. And so I guess to answer your question, that's not something that takes time to develop. That's just very quickly, right away. After that first meal, you'll be able to see, oh my God, my dog's glucose numbers are completely different than they were before.
Yeah, no, that's good. You mentioned lifespan differences. Did you compare that to, just carnivore diets, or did you compare it to your kibble versus not your kibble? Have you gotten to the point where you've been able to do, let's say, a clinical trial with your kibble versus others?
We are actually in the process of running a clinical trial right now. Lifespan is not one of the outcomes we are looking at. And the only reason for that you could probably guess if you thought about it long enough, but basically it takes forever.
It takes a long time. Right.
Yeah, it takes forever. We've been in business for 4 years. We'd have to run a study for 10 more at least in order to get good data on that, which is not realistic for us at this point. So the stuff we are looking at is stuff that you can measure within a period of like 2 months and see if there's going to be a change. And so it's body composition and fat content. It's blood sugar and circulating insulin. And it's other kind of biomarkers of that, like biomarkers of inflammation, stuff like that. We're running it in conjunction with a Canadian university called the University of Guelph. And I expect that we'll be publishing stuff by the end of 22, would be my best guess. But it will be stuff that if the results come out, as I'm hugely confident they will, it deserves to give the veterinary community a real shock as to what they're doing with respect to treating dogs for diabetes and for obesity.
Well, what anecdotally have you observed, by seeing, let's say, testimonials from dozens of customers and for you yourself with your animals? Like, what can you, again, I know it's not a clinical trial, but what can you say seems to be happening to your customers that are using this predominantly instead of the old stuff they're using?
So some of there's stuff we can feel really confident is happening. Like I said, with regard to body composition and regards to kind of metabolic stuff, blood sugar, insulin, other hormones, that kind of thing. That's all, I know that's going on because it's been well studied. And when you have consumers who are motivated enough to actually measure that stuff meaningfully, like diabetics actually, they measure blood sugar because they need to do that in order to know how much insulin to give their dogs. We can tell that's going on. From an anecdotal perspective, you definitely get the anecdotes about dogs losing body fat. And my own, I have a St. Bernard, a big adult male St. Bernard now, and I adopted him. And when I adopted him, he was already 5 years old. And I adopted him from a nice family. I don't even know why they gave him up. I didn't really pry, but sweet people, but none of them had written a book about dog obesity. And so none of them were really hip to that issue. And so he was kind of a fat boy when I got him. He wasn't colossal where everybody, no matter how much you've looked at this issue, would be oh yeah, that dog is definitely obese, but enough that my, kind of seasoned eye could be oh yeah, this dog is overweight. And he's 165 pounds then. And I swear on my life, this is the only thing that we did to make his life any different was put him on ketona, which is just say we got rid of all the carbohydrate in his diet. And he's a 130-pound dog now. And he's ripped. It's you can see, how it looks when you don't have much fat. You look like an athlete, basically. You can see certain bones, the ribs. You can see a lot of the musculature. And it's just so uncommon in St. Bernards. It's so weird. He's so athletic. And it's just not at all what I thought of as I think of a St. Bernard as big, lumbering, huge, messy dog.
Yeah, slobbering dog. Yeah.
Not what he is. He it just moves like a very little, I don't know, herding dog or something, but just at 6 times the size. When he runs, he's really low to the ground and his back is perfectly horizontal and he can move super fast. And it's just he's really impressive. So you see a lot.
Beautiful. That's cool.
It is cool. It is cool. And he's almost 10 years old now too, which is outside the lifespan that's expected from them. So I can't, that stuff's really hard. Who knows about, it's irresponsible for me to make claims about lifespan, but I can tell you that it is absolutely the case that the leaner your dog is, the longer it is likely to live, and that carbohydrate makes your dog fat. So I've never run a study that on exactly what the lifespan difference between our product and some other product is. But those two things are both true. And so it certainly stands to reason that if you want your dog to live as long as possible, as I do, that you should make it as lean as possible, which means get the carbohydrate out of its diet. Yeah. So a common enough problem that a lot of pet owners experience are dogs and cats that have have skin reactions basically to certain ingredients. And more often than not, what that is, in my experience, is the starch content. It's kind of the carbohydrate mix and the type of starch that's in there. And so it is really quite rare that you have, it's not the reason for the product, but it's very rare that our customers go, oh my God, my dog was really itchy and was such a problem when I put him on your diet. Typically clears up stuff like that. Yeah.
A friend of mine just mentioned that he changed to some other food and his dog was having a lot of problems. So he changed back and then the dog was okay. Do you have any experience on what ingredients you've seen out there that do cause dogs to itch or have adverse reactions?
I mean, it's not there are plenty of dogs that don't develop skin reactions or digestive reactions, but there are also plenty that do to products like corn. Basically, it's like a very inflammatory thing. Your dog has learned over the past, evolutionary blink of an eye to digest that stuff, to like actually pull nutritional energy from that stuff, but just barely. It's been digesting meat products, proteins and fats for hundreds of millions of generations. And now it just recently can just barely digest starch. But the gut microbiome has to be like balanced to it. Like this is what your friend experienced when if you're looking at switching dog food products and you look at the new one and you look at the back of the bag, it'll tell you transition onto this product slowly. Like over the course of the week, gradually give your dog more and more. And the reason is because if you don't do that, if you just change it very abruptly, dogs very often experience digestive upset. They get diarrhea or vomit or what have you. And the reason for that is because as they've been on one diet for a very long time, and because it's hard for them to digest starch, their gut microbiome gets like, how there's just like, I don't know, millions of different species of gut microbiota that have to like over time, depending on what you eat, become very attuned to your diet and the ecosystem develops in a certain kind of way. And if you just switch that all of a sudden, switch the kind of, basically the animal's not prepared to just all of a sudden start digesting a completely different carbohydrate profile. And so that's something that's very common when you switch from, a product that's whatever, heavily based on corn to one that's heavily based on, potato or oats or something like that. And we make sure that we tell our consumers, when you're switching on our product, you can switch over right away. Don't worry about all that transitional stuff, because it's not necessary. Dogs don't have any trouble digesting protein and fat. And so you get rid of carbohydrate. You never experience those same kind of digestive issues during transition.
Well, very good, Daniel. What's the best place for people to find out more about your product? Where can they go?
Yeah, so our website is KetoNaturalPetFoods.com. You can find the product on major online retail platforms as well. We don't sell it in brick and mortar. It's all through e-commerce channels. You can find me if you poke around the internet enough. You can find copies of my book, which is called Dogs, Dogfood, and Dogma, and purchase that from retailers as well. But we try to make our philosophy is that pet owners deserve a smarter pet food industry than they've got right now. And so we speak to you like you're an adult, and we talk about things like evidence and real measurable health outcomes, and don't talk so much in platitudes and kind of hollow slogans. And so I think your listeners will find that if you go to our website, KetoNaturalPetFoods.com, you'll learn a lot about what we're trying to do. We don't hide the ball, and you'll learn kind of we're trying to be a substantive, like differentiated company. And so you can learn a lot about what we do just going to that site.
Well, Daniel, thank you for coming on the podcast. And it's nice to see someone that, has such a passion for dog health. It's really cool.
Yeah, man. By all means, if your listeners have questions, I'm easy enough to find. If you ever want to have me back, I could talk about this stuff until the cows. My pleasure.
Oh, again, thank you for coming, Daniel. I appreciate it.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at FindingGeniusPodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.